What kind of preparations does a legend make for his own passing? The world had not yet recovered from the grief when the Prince of Darkness took his final breath on July 22, 2025, after a long battle with years of cruel and painful illness. Ozzy Osbourne seemed to sense that his final day was near. Just a few days before he passed away, he revealed heartbreaking secrets to the people closest to him, including Tony Iommi, his lifelong brother-in-arms, something that could shatter even the strongest of hearts. Before we begin, let us raise a thumb as a gesture of honor and remembrance for the rock legend. And perhaps the most haunting part of all, Ozzy seemed to know. In a moment that now feels almost prophetic, he stepped into the spotlight one final time, not just to perform, but to say goodbye. On July 5, 2025, under the open skies of Villa Park Stadium in Birmingham, Ozzy Osbourne took the stage for what would be his final performance. He was not standing. He couldn't. Battling Parkinson's disease and the aftermath of multiple spinal surgeries, he sat atop a custom-made winged leather throne, a haunting yet powerful symbol of a man refusing to let go of the music, the stage, the fans who had walked with him through decades of pain, glory, chaos, and creation. That throne, designed just for him, became more than a seat. It became a monument to endurance. Over 45,000 fans filled the stadium that night, while 5.8 million more tuned in around the globe. They thought they were witnessing a celebration, a homecoming, perhaps. No one imagined they were watching the curtain fall. The concert was titled Back to the Beginning, a tribute to Birmingham, the city where Black Sabbath was born, where Ozzy and Tony first met as boys, dreaming of something beyond the smoke-stained skies of factory-lined streets. And that night, the dream came full circle. The original Black Sabbath lineup, reunited after 2 decades apart, stood together one last time. The music was raw, stripped of glamour and pyrotechnics. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a farewell. Metallica, Slayer, Guns N' Roses, Tool, and Pantera shared the stage in tribute. The audience roared, cried, and held their breath as Ozzy poured every ounce of remaining strength into his vocals. He didn't just sing, he bled through every note. Behind the scenes, it was clear to those closest to him that Ozzy was holding on, barely. Tony Iommi would later recall, "We think he held out just to do that show." Ozzy himself had said he'd rather die singing in Birmingham than rot in a hospital bed. He meant every word. After the concert, there was no grand celebration. Ozzy, exhausted, was wheeled into his dressing room. But before leaving, he rolled into Tony's, cracked a tired smile, and simply said, "It went all right, didn't it?" That quiet moment, those few words, meant more than any encore. No one knew then what he would later whisper to Tony in private, words that would surface only after the world went silent. On the night of July 21st, just 2 weeks after the concert, Ozzy Osbourne died peacefully in his sleep at his Buckinghamshire home, surrounded by Sharon and their children. He was 76. The world woke to heartbreak. News outlets stumbled over the announcement. Fans posted candlelit tributes outside his childhood home in Aston, and fellow musicians across genres, from Elton John to James Hetfield, shared memories that spoke of a man whose voice had not only defined heavy metal, but transcended genre and generation. Yet no tribute struck deeper than the silence that followed. A silence too heavy to break. A silence filled with everything Ozzy had given, and everything he left behind. That concert raised €140 million for Parkinson's research and Birmingham Children's Hospital. But its greatest legacy wasn't financial. It was human. It was the vision of a man nearly broken by time and illness, who stood, not on his feet, but in spirit, before the world, and said goodbye without saying a word. As Paranoid rang out for the final time and the stage lights dimmed, there were no fireworks, no spectacle. Only the soft tremble of Ozzy's hand raised in farewell, Tony's eyes wet with a grief too personal for words, and a crowd united in knowing they had witnessed the end of something immortal. In that moment, the world didn't just lose a musician, it lost a force of nature. And Tony Iommi, left holding the final echo of that night, could only whisper what millions now feel. There will never be another Ozzy. But in the midst of global mourning, all eyes turned to one man, the one who had stood by Ozzy from the beginning, through every storm, every silence, and every scream. Tony Iommi. What he revealed just hours later would bring a new wave of heartbreak the world wasn't prepared for. On the morning of July 23, 2025, the world was still drowning in grief when Tony Iommi finally spoke. For decades, he had stood beside Ozzy Osbourne through storms of fame, addiction, recovery, and reinvention. But this time, his voice trembled not with stage power, but with quiet devastation. In an emotional interview with ITV News, Tony admitted that the loss hadn't fully sunk in until the next day. "I woke up and it hit me like a ton of bricks," he said, eyes downcast, his voice breaking under the weight of memory. Just hours before Ozzy's death, Tony had received a final text message from his old friend. Simple, tired words that now read like a goodbye wrapped in exhaustion. He said he was really tired. No energy left, Tony recalled. And I just thought, oh no, something's not right. Looking back, he believes Ozzy had held on, with everything he had, just to make it through that one last concert. The signs were there, but no one wanted to believe them. Tony described Ozzy's appearance during rehearsals as frail, his body clearly strained. They had deliberately limited his time on stage, allowing him to rest between songs, reminisce about old times, and smile through the fatigue. Behind the scenes, it wasn't about perfect notes or polished performances. It was about honoring the decades they had shared, the legacy they had built, and the unspoken goodbye that was quietly taking shape. "I think he knew it was the last one," Tony said. "He never said it, but you could feel it." But perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment came when Tony shared Ozzy's final wish, something so simple, yet so deeply human. Ozzy had quietly told him, weeks before the concert, that he didn't want a grand spectacle or a farewell tour. He just wanted one last chance to thank the fans in the place where it all began. A modest performance in Birmingham. A final goodbye. He wanted to go out doing what he loved, and where it all started, Tony whispered. That's all he ever asked. The realization that Ozzy had been planning his own farewell all along crushed those who knew him best. It wasn't a headline or a press release. It was a fading man in a leather throne, pouring out every last ounce of himself for the people who had stood by him. Tony said it best. "Geezer, Bill and I, we didn't just lose a bandmate. We lost our brother." For Tony Iommi, this loss is not just personal, it's foundational. Ozzy was the voice that gave life to his riffs, the chaos to his calm, the madness to his structure. Their bond wasn't forged in contracts or fame. It was welded in the smoke-filled streets of Birmingham, in schoolyard laughs, and the dreams of two working-class boys who dared to imagine something more. As Tony spoke, the world listened. Not just because he was a musical legend, but because, in his grief, people saw their own. And in his tears, they remembered the man who made them feel invincible, even as he was, quietly preparing to say goodbye. Before the fame, before the roaring crowds and the thunder of guitars, there were just two boys in Aston, Ozzy and Tony. Theirs was a friendship forged not in studios or spotlights, but in the smoke-stained air of Birmingham's working-class streets, where dreams felt too big for the factories that lined the horizon. They first crossed paths at Birchfield Road School in the early 1960s, long before the world would come to know them as the godfathers of heavy metal. Ozzy, born John Michael Osbourne, was the class clown, loud, mischievous, and endlessly funny. He struggled with schoolwork, particularly reading and writing, but made up for it with a charm that made people laugh even on the bleakest days. Tony Iommi, on the other hand, was quiet, reserved, and deeply introspective. He was the kind of boy who spoke less and watched more, already carrying the seriousness of someone who felt the weight of the world early on. Despite their differences, something unspoken connected them. They lived just streets apart, grew up in homes where money was tight, and shared the unspoken fear of ending up on the factory floor like so many before them. What they had in common was more powerful than what made them different: a longing for escape, for meaning, for music. Years later, Tony would reflect on those days with a heavy fondness. He remembered how Ozzy stood out, not because he was loud, but because there was something irrepressible in his spirit, even then. Birmingham, with its gray skies and harder days, wasn't known for producing rock legends. But somehow, out of that soot and struggle, two boys began dreaming. They weren't close friends from the start, but time and circumstances wove them together. What began as simple familiarity in school corridors gradually grew into a bond rooted in shared hardship and silent ambition. In the evenings, their paths would cross outside of school, in neighborhood alleys, on long walks home, and eventually, in the early whispers of musical ambition. Before the world knew the name Black Sabbath, before Ozzy would sing to millions, and Tony would command the stage with his dark, thundering riffs, there was simply a boy who made jokes, and a boy who dreamed in silence. And perhaps that's what made their bond unbreakable through the decades of fame, chaos, addiction, and eventual farewell. Because at their core, they were just two boys from Aston, who never forgot where they came from. This wasn't just a musical partnership. It was the kind of friendship that outlives stages, record deals, and even death. And in remembering where it all began, Tony Iommi, now in his late 70s, doesn't just mourn the loss of a bandmate. He mourns the boy who made him laugh in school, the friend who pulled faces backstage, the brother who never stopped being Ozzy. That kind of love doesn't fade. It becomes legend. In the early 1970s, something emerged from the soot and steel of Birmingham that would forever change the sound of music. It wasn't polished or safe. It was raw, thunderous, and unnerving. It was the birth of Black Sabbath, and with it, the genesis of a new genre: heavy metal. For Ozzy Osbourne and Tony Iommi, this wasn't just music, it was survival. It was their voice, their rebellion, and their prayer, forged in the fires of a working-class city that offered little more than factory jobs and a lifetime of toil. Their debut album, Black Sabbath, released in 1970, didn't just introduce a band, it cast a shadow across the entire music industry. The opening track, beginning with ominous church bells and the rumble of distant thunder, warned listeners that what they were about to hear was unlike anything before. It was dark, almost apocalyptic, with Iommi's sinister guitar riffs and Ozzy's haunting vocals echoing the disillusionment and anxiety of a generation. The album didn't ask for permission, It demanded attention, and it got it. Just months later, they unleashed Paranoid, an album that would cement their legacy. Tracks like Iron Man, War Pigs, and the title song Paranoid weren't just hits. They were battle cries. These songs captured the discontent and confusion of a world still reeling from war, facing political unrest, and witnessing cultural upheaval. Ozzy's voice cut through the noise like a siren, piercing, emotional, unmistakable, while Iommi's guitar weaved dark, hypnotic patterns that no one had ever heard before. The lyrics were brutally honest. War Pigs condemned the architects of war with venomous clarity. Iron Man, with its tale of betrayal and revenge, became an anthem for the misunderstood and the misjudged. And Paranoid, written in a burst of desperation in just 20 minutes, resonated with everyone who had ever felt trapped inside their own mind. As their fame grew, so did their ambition. Albums like Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage weren't just continuations, they were evolutions. Iommi's guitar work grew more experimental, layered, and complex. He played through pain, quite literally. After losing the tips of his fingers in an industrial accident, he fashioned prosthetics and pushed through, creating a heavier, darker sound that became the band's signature. Meanwhile, Ozzy's lyrics became more introspective, exploring themes of addiction, mental illness, and the suffocating weight of fame. They didn't glamorize darkness. They lived it, and it showed in every note. Their success was staggering. Throughout the 1970s, Black Sabbath sold out arenas around the world, becoming one of the most influential bands in rock history. But their journey wasn't without struggle. Behind the screaming crowds and chart-topping records were personal demons, relentless touring, and the crushing pressure of expectation. Still, the chemistry between Ozzy and Tony was undeniable. Iommi once reflected, "What we created together was bigger than any one of us." That bond, rooted in schoolyard memories and tempered by the fires of fame, was the heart of Black Sabbath. They weren't just making music. They were building a world, a mythology, a refuge for the misfits and the brokenhearted. Their songs became lifelines for kids who felt unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. And while critics initially dismissed them, history would vindicate them. Bands like Metallica, Iron Maiden, Slayer, and countless others would later credit Sabbath as their foundation, their inspiration, their reason for picking up an instrument. By the end of the decade, Black Sabbath had sold over 75 million records. But more than that, they had become symbols of resilience. They proved that two boys from Aston, born into poverty and raised under smoke-stained skies, could carve out a place in history, not by fitting in, but by standing defiantly apart. Their music didn't just entertain, it endured. It defied time, trends, and even tragedy. As Ozzy and Tony took the stage together in later years, older, weathered, but still powerful, the weight of that legacy was not lost on them. Every chord, every lyric, was a reminder of where they'd come from, what they'd survived, and the mark they had left on the world. The rise of Black Sabbath wasn't just a chapter in rock history, it was a revolution. And at its core were two friends, brothers in music, who turned pain into power and silence into a roar that still echoes today. By the late 1970s, the weight of success and excess had begun to take its toll. Behind the thundering riffs and sold-out arenas, a storm was brewing, and at its center was Ozzy Osbourne. The voice that had helped birth heavy metal was now drowning in a whirlpool of drugs, alcohol, and inner turmoil. In 1979, after months of missed rehearsals, erratic behavior, and growing concern from the rest of the band, Tony Iommi made what he later called the hardest decision of his life: to let Ozzy go. It wasn't anger that fueled it, it was desperation. As Tony recalled, "We were watching him die slowly, and we didn't know how to save him." And so, after a decade of creating the unthinkable together, the bond was broken. Black Sabbath continued, bringing in legends like Ronnie James Dio and Ian Gillan to fill the void, each adding their own color to the Sabbath legacy. But something essential was missing. Without Ozzy, the sound was still powerful, still groundbreaking, but the alchemy, that unexplainable magic between Ozzy and Tony, had been fractured. Ozzy spiraled. The years that followed were chaotic, filled with arrests, rehab, and nearly fatal mistakes. Yet from the depths of addiction and despair, he clawed his way back. The world watched in awe as the so-called Prince of Darkness reinvented himself as a solo artist. Hits like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley proved he wasn't done yet. But even as he climbed back to the top, something haunted both him and Tony: an unfinished song between brothers. For decades, fans dreamed of a reunion, and rumors came and went like passing storms. It wasn't until 2011 that the impossible finally began to take shape. Despite years of silence, when Ozzy and Tony sat down together again, the old connection sparked almost instantly. They laughed. They remembered. They created. And from that reunion came not just closure, but rebirth. In 2013, Black Sabbath released the album 13, their first studio record with Ozzy in 35 years. The album soared to #1 in multiple countries, including the UK and the US. It was more than a chart success. It was a defiant statement. Time had not broken them. Age had not silenced them. And though original drummer Bill Ward was absent due to contract disputes, the core spirit of Sabbath lived on. The following world tour, titled The End, was a cathartic journey through decades of sound, scars, and survival. Audiences wept as Ozzy, older but unyielding, stood beside Tony once more. The riffs were slower, the notes a bit rougher, but the power, the unity, the legacy was unmistakable. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was history correcting itself. It was healing. Tony would later reflect, "We'd been through everything: fame, fallout, addiction, near death. But standing beside Ozzy again, it felt like home." That feeling wasn't just personal. It radiated through every show, every interview, every chord. Fans felt it too, the sense that something sacred had come full circle. It wasn't a band reunion. It was a soul reunion. In those final years together, Ozzy and Tony forged something purer than ever before. The music no longer chased charts or critics. It sought connection, memory, meaning. They weren't just performing songs. They were telling their story. A story of brokenness, forgiveness, and the long road back to brotherhood. And though their time was now finite, and their bodies older, there was a fire in those final performances that no youth could match. It was the fire of survival. The fire of knowing just how much had almost been lost. When they took their final bow together, it wasn't the end of Black Sabbath. It was the closing of a chapter that had defied all odds. They had fought their demons, and, against all expectation, they had won. For Tony, that victory was deeply personal. "I didn't just get my bandmate back," he said. "I got my friend back, my brother." In a world that had seen so many rock stories end in bitterness and silence, theirs became something different. A story of redemption, of rising again, even from ashes, of finishing the song, no matter how long it took. And so, long before Ozzy's final goodbye, the healing had begun. On stage, under the lights, beside the man who had once had to let him go, Ozzy Osbourne didn't just find his voice again. He found his way home. In the days following Ozzy Osbourne's death, as the world mourned and tributes poured in from every corner of the music industry, one voice resonated with a weight that none could match. Tony Iommi. For Tony, this wasn't just the loss of a musical partner. It was the end of a lifelong bond, a brotherhood forged in hardship, rebellion, and sound. When asked to summarize what Ozzy meant to him, Tony didn't hesitate. There's never going to be another Ozzy. Those 7 words carried not just grief, but reverence. A deep, unshakable knowing that the world had lost something singular. He spoke not as a legend mourning another, but as a friend looking back on decades of shared moments that no stage, no album, no spotlight could truly capture. Tony remembered the laughter first, the backstage antics, the silly faces Ozzy would pull mid-performance, the way he'd break tension with a perfectly timed joke. These weren't rehearsed moments. They were Ozzy, unpredictable, raw, and filled with a kind of light that no darkness could ever extinguish. He'd pull a face right in the middle of a song. Tony smiled, voice cracking, and I'd just lose it. That was his gift too, making the serious feel human. But memory isn't kind. It brings with it not only warmth, but the sting of what will never be again. And in those reflections, Tony found himself reliving both the glory and the pain, the heights of global stardom, and the lows of separation, addiction, and the long path back to each other. He remembered the months when Ozzy was unreachable, the darkness that took over, the public stumbles that masked private agony. And he remembered the comeback, the reunion in 2013 for the 13 album and the world tour that followed. How against all odds, they found their rhythm again, not just musically, but as brothers. Ozzy had said, back then, through tears and laughter, "We're lucky bastards, aren't we? Still alive, still screaming." There was one moment, private, almost whispered, that now haunts Tony more than any other. Just days before their final concert, Ozzy looked at him and said, "I'm not sure I'll survive this show, mate. But if I'm going out, let it be while I'm singing in Birmingham, not rotting in a hospital bed." Tony never forgot those words. He didn't reply at the time. He couldn't. But now, those words echo louder than any guitar riff. "We think he knew," Tony would later say. "He chose to close his life where it all began, with us, with music." That was his way of saying thank you. And it wasn't just about the show, it was about reclaiming his final breath, not as a patient, but as a performer. Not in silence, but in song. That final show, titled Back to the Beginning, was no spectacle. It was a love letter to Birmingham, to fans, to friendship. No fireworks, no theatrics. Just Ozzy, seated in his custom-built leather throne, eyes burning with fatigue and determination, holding the mic as though it were the last thing tethering him to this world. He gave it everything, his pain, his joy, his legacy, in every note. And then, quietly, he rolled off stage and into memory. For Tony, that night wasn't just a performance, it was closure. The final page in a story written over 50 years, with ink made of riffs, screams, laughter, and pain. Ozzy wasn't just the Prince of Darkness. He was the boy from Aston who dreamed out loud, who made mischief in the schoolyard, who dared to believe he could scream loud enough to escape fate. He was who he was, Tony said. No filter, no pretending. He lived hard, he loved deep, and he never apologized for being Ozzy. Ozzy's legacy isn't only in his music. It's in the way he made people feel. in the way his voice could shatter fear, in the way his madness could become a form of healing. From the front rows of sold-out arenas to the quiet corners of hospital rooms where fans fought their own battles, Ozzy's music became more than sound. It became sanctuary. And that, Tony says, is what makes him immortal. He wasn't just the voice of a genre. He was the heartbeat of a movement. You could hear him in every riff that cried out against injustice, in every lyric that echoed loneliness and rage, and in every fan who found strength through the noise. Tony's voice wavered at Ozzy's memorial, but he stood tall, as if borrowing strength from his fallen brother. "This isn't goodbye," he told the sea of mourners. "This is thank you for every scream, for every laugh, for every scar and every song." He left like a king, quietly, with dignity, with music. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. The air was thick with memory, grief, and an unspoken unity that only true legends can create. Fans stood shoulder to shoulder, some crying, some smiling through tears, all remembering not just the icon, but the man. Ozzy Osbourne's echo lives on in every backstage story, every haunting lyric, every mischief-laden wink. He wasn't just part of music history. He bent history around him. He redefined what it meant to be broken and brilliant at the same time. And in doing so, he gave generations permission to be loud, to be flawed, to be real. Tony now walks forward carrying the silence Ozzy left behind. Not empty, but full of meaning, full of legacy. Have you ever had to say goodbye to someone who shaped your soul? A friend? A brother? Someone whose voice became part of your heartbeat? It's unbearably painful, isn't it? If Ozzy's voice ever carried you through the darkness or lit your fire when the world grew cold, share your memory below. Let his echo live on, not just in the music, but in you. Because for those who truly listened, he never really left. There will never be another Ozzy.